I am so pleased to have Michael Cory here. Michael is a medicinal chemist by training and by profession, and he has lived in places such as North Carolina and Palo Alto and Seattle, and he has family here and has been here for about 20 years or so now. And he became very interested in he was growing orchids and other things before he came to Seattle, but he was very fascinated by the Volunteer Park Conservatory and started to volunteer there very quickly after he came to Seattle. So we were very fortunate to have him here, and I've learned things just sitting next to him and chatting. So hopefully all those things will be repeated. So Michael, would you?
Well, Susan, thank you very much for the invitation. Can everybody hear? Am I close enough? Okay, great. Nick did the setup, so it's very nice. So I've entitled this Everything and More Than You Ever Wanted to Know About Orchids. So I may cover some aspects of orchids that you hadn't thought about, but I think it's important to understand the plants that you're trying to grow. A lot of this is going to be background and things about Washington State and things about orchids worldwide. They're pretty fascinating plants. But the first thing on my next slide, is some terminology, because I'm going to unfortunately drop a bunch of terminology. Much of it will be familiar to you. So the species is defined as plants that can interbreed and give fertile offspring. Okay, so I'm going to talk a lot about orchid species. The genus is a group of similar species, and the genus is a made-up idea by people. Okay, so that in other words, to cluster similar things. Well, how do you cluster similar things? You take a bunch of species and you cluster them together. You say all these are related to each other. We'll call that a genus. Okay? A hybrid is a plant of two or more species. So, and most of what we deal with are hybrid orchids. Okay? Because species orchids are a little bit unusual. An epiphyte, and this is really important for the plants that we grow. An epiphyte is a plant growing on the outside of another plant. Not a parasite, on the outside of another plant. Now, we don't see very many epiphytes. I don't know if we see any epiphytes in Washington State. But we're not talking about plants from Washington State. We're talking about tropical plants. And in the tropical jungle, there's plants all over. I guess we do see some ferns growing on trees here, really wet areas everywhere. We see ferns growing on trees. Those ferns, while they'll grow in the ground, they'll be terrestrials, there's that next word, terrestrials, growing in the ground. They also can grow on the outside of a tree, acting like an epiphyte. And then a saprophyte, and I only mention this word because there are saprophytes in Washington State, saprophytic orchids that you could see if you know where to look. But most of us have a Phalaenopsis orchid. That's a Phalaenopsis orchid. Okay? Also called the moth orchid. I don't know why. It doesn't look like a moth to me, but I guess it's a selling point, or maybe not, I don't know. So that's a Phalaenopsis, that's a hybrid, That is, it's a cross of two or more species. The Phalaenopsis are tropical plants. Okay, they grow, the center of their growth, the center of the Phalaenopsis genus is the Philippine Islands. Where are the Philippine Islands? Well, they're right on the equator. Okay, they're in Asia, or close to Asia, next to Asia. So these plants, these Phalaenopsis that we're trying to grow in our apartment, are from the rainforests of the Philippines, right on the equator. And that's sort of the kind of thing you have to think about when you're trying to grow Phalaenopsis in your house. They'll grow in your house very well for indefinitely, but you have to think about where they came from and how to treat them. Now, these are some orchids that you don't normally see. Unless you come over to the conservatory, you can see some of those. I've been volunteering at the Volunteer Park Conservatory with the orchid collection for 12 years. And I've been volunteering in the conservatory over there for 20 years, since we moved here. It's a great place, and the only place in Seattle where you can see orchids in public other than the grocery store. And each of these photographs represents a different genus of orchids found in different places. Okay, slipper orchids, like the one on the upper right, are Asian. Okay, but there are slipper orchids in Washington State, if you can find them in the springtime. So you see, there's a wide diversity of color and shapes and sizes. So orchids are pervasive worldwide. There's 24,000 species. And I went out on the website yesterday and checked out a website that I look at quite a bit. And it has 25,704 species. So this is already out of date. People are discovering orchids all the time. Okay, scientists go out, botanists go out in the woods, and they do what they call transepts. They decide to get on a line, and they look at all the plants on that line, geographic line, whether it's mountains, valleys, and usually they come back with some new orchid species. So there's about 100 new orchid species discovered each year. Even new genuses discovered each year. They're more than 10% of the world's flowering plants. So having 25,000 species is pretty large. They're basically fairly small, so you don't think of them as being a major plant colony. And they're found everywhere, 6 of the 7 continents. They're found everywhere but Antarctica. So, as I said, I'll talk about the Washington State orchids. There's many in the United States, in the 48 states. There are many in Alaska and Canada, all the way up to the coldest areas in Canada. They're also the best-selling flowering plant. Okay, if you go into any grocery store, any big box store, they have orchids. There's probably, if you go down to Whole Foods down here, they probably have 50 on display. If you go to Trader Joe's, there's probably 100 there, because Trader Joe's really has a big collection. Now, why can we see so many plants? Why are they just pervasive everywhere? Well, new cultural practices have made them get very low prices. So you see them for $7, $9, $15, $40. I mean, you can see all different price ranges. The cloning techniques, using tissue culture and cloning orchids, have given you billions, literally, of identical plants. So the growers can be sure that everything in their greenhouse is the same. Why do they want everything the same? Well, I don't know how many Trader Joe's there are in the country, but they want to sell 100 plants to every Trader Joe's, right? If you're looking at it from the nursery point of view. So they have a whole big greenhouse full of plants. They want them to be all the same. And they can have them all the same, and they can tell Trader Joe's, well, we'll give you 10 here and 10 here and 10 there and 10 there. So they have tremendous tissue culture facilities. They have gigantic specialty orchid specialty nurseries. Now, they've gotten a little smaller as an industry in the past few years, taken out by the marijuana growers. So the marijuana growers can make a lot of money in a riskier business than the orchid growers, but they can make more money. So many of the sort of smaller orchid nurseries have been pushed out of business. They have a long history of use as decoration. So, I mean, orchids have been around to wear forever. And I'll talk some more about that in a few minutes. And there's been a lot of promotion of orchids, and the presence, having them there every day in the market, means that you can sort of count on it. You can sort of count on a nice gift. So, and then they're readily available, as I said. So here's a mature orchid seed pod. And I'll come back to do some more about this. You've probably never seen one, except the ones you eat. And here is what the seeds look like. Orchid seeds are tiny, okay? Orchids provide absolutely no allergies, okay? Not like most of our allergies are due to the pollen being blown in the wind. Orchid seeds are blown in the wind, but they provide no allergies. So each pod has millions of seeds in it. The seeds get blown in the wind and land on the proper place and produce new plants. Well, having the seed pods allows you to grow thousands of orchids that are related to each other. So you can do a lot of hybridizing. You can mix plants and get a seed pod and see which one is the best. And you can hybridize it and grow it up. And then you can use cloning techniques, laboratory techniques, to grow millions of identical plants. So you have a way to get a very large variety of plants, and at the same time, a way to get very, very, very large number of similar plants. So you have both tools. So in a large nursery, they've taken these seeds and put them into bottles. Okay, and this picture shows two different kinds of bottles of seeds growing into plants. So each one of those little green plants is an independent plant grown in a community pot. They call those community pots. So these are photographs from a laboratory where they're cloning the plants and they're growing up millions of identical plants. They turn those plants, when they break them out of the bottle and they plant them in the individual containers, And they have a community pot of plants at the next stage. And then the next stage is when they're going to the single plants in a container. And then each of these plants will go to the next size and be sold in the store. So they can actually go in a greenhouse in 18 months from this size to saleable size. So I've got a few slides here about a kind of a fascinating aspect of orchids and the sale, and I'm talking about the sales over the years. This is Brachyolalia cattleya, Mrs. Herbert Hoover. This was named after a first lady 100 years ago, okay, when Herbert Hoover was president. So one of the nurseries in the East, in Virginia actually, decided to name plants, make hybrids. This is a hybrid. Brachyolalia cattleya is 3 different genuses. Brassavola, Laelia, and Cattleya are 3 different genuses. So you can have multiple genuses in your hybrid crosses. So they made this quite pretty plant and named it after Herbert Hoover. This has been maintained by children, by the son of the original founder, and along the line they had a Cattleya Best Truman. Okay, and there is Best Truman wearing Cattleya Best Truman quite a while ago. And that's when orchids were really sold as corsages. And you may remember from high school prom and stuff that was the big thing to buy was an orchid. Okay. So here are a couple more examples. Michelle Obama and Melania Trump. Okay, so they've kept this up over the years. And then here's Art Chadwick and Jill Biden in the White House with Cattleya Jill Biden. And Art Chadwick still runs a nursery. He's the son of the original person who did this work. And he's maintaining the kind of quirky business. Let's bring it closer to home and talk about Washington State orchids. We have about 40 species. I say about because there's a little bit of argument about whether some of them are species or some of them should be grouped together. They're the same species growing in different situations, and there's always a lot of controversy about these things. They're all terrestrials, or some are saprophytes, but they're all in the ground. There's nothing growing, there's no epiphytes growing in trees that are orchids here in the state. The epiphytic orchids, like the Phalaenopsis, grow in very tropical countries like the Philippines, okay? Very, very warm all the time, and they can grow all year round. But we do have orchids in the state. You don't see them in Seattle. Unfortunately, orchids have been absolutely wiped out wherever man is. We are terrible for natural orchids. We're just the worst thing. You disturb the soil and it takes them a long time to come back, okay, until some seeds land in the right spot and they come back. You can find orchids in parks. And here's a list of parks where I have actually seen orchids growing in the ground and seen them. So in hiking around in the mountains, was always looking for orchids and frequently could find them. Now, Calypso bulbosa is the fairy slipper, one that's found in parks. It looks like this up close, and then there's another view. It's a slipper orchid, and it's found all over the West Coast. Not in Southern California, but in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and into Canada. Another one is a slipper orchid, lady slipper, Cypripedium montanum, that's found in the mountains. It's absolutely beautiful. This is a fairly rare one for Washington State, but it's found in other states in the West. It's really pretty. It's about the same height as the lady slipper, the fairy slipper. The coral rhiza maculata is another one that's found in the state. Quite common when you go out in the woods at the right time of the year. And I've seen this growing on private property, Camino Island, for example, but you won't see it anywhere in the city. Very pretty. Another one is Goodyear oblongifolia. It's the rattlesnake plantain is a common name, and you can see the plant part with the stripe down the middle of the leaf all the time in Mount Rainier, all over the place in Mount Rainier at elevations of about 1,000 feet. You have to go in July and August at the right time of year to see it in bloom. But it's there and it's really common. So you can find Goodyear quite common in Mount Rainier. And I've seen it on Mount Si. So we have tremendous threats to orchids in general. You just don't see them where there's a lot of people because they disturb the soil and it takes forever for the orchids to come back. They have a slow reproduction, a slow growth rate. It's hard to recover from disturbed land. Agriculture damaged the habitat for orchids and they never come back. Populations, when they do come back, are picked for good or bad reasons. The public's lack of knowledge of what's going on puts a lot of pressure on orchids. A lot of places have groups that try to rescue orchids from new developments. So when you're putting in a new development, you're frequently disturbing some very nice orchid habitat. And orchid societies have groups that go out and try to rescue those plants. This was really common in North Carolina. We were trying to rescue plants out of the woods all the times. In less developed countries, of course, where an awful lot of these orchids are, there's just very little conservation. They don't have a lot of resources to spend on conservation. There is an organization in the world called CITES, which is a convention on the international trade in endangered species. This covers a lot of things: rhinoceroses, elephants, and orchids, all in the same law. And CITES says that it's illegal to import orchids from overseas into the United States, for example, without the proper documentation. Documentation that you didn't go out in the jungle and rip it out of the ground and bring it in. That you're a scientist who is studying things, or that you are a licensed nursery. So those are the rules. All the orchids, every orchid practically is listed on the CITES regulations. The orchids can't be exported from their country legally without the right proper paperwork. There's a lot of smuggling going on anyhow, all the time. And there's a lot of arrests made for smuggling orchids. The United States has a special clearance, special law on Phalaenopsis from Taiwan. It was negotiated a number of years ago. it allows those early small pot stages of the orchids to be done in Taiwan under very different conditions than here. A very low cost because no energy is needed in their greenhouses. They have weather that fits Phalaenopsis. So they bring Phalaenopsis plants with a leaf span, of an inch or 2 inches by the billions into the United States. Then the greenhouses grow them up to larger size and sell them. So that's one of the things that keeps the price down, is this agreement to bring Phalaenopsis in. So let's go from the wild to something of the history of orchids. So Charles Darwin published a book in 1862. So this is a few years after the origin of the species, about orchids. He was studying orchids as part of his studies on biology. So he wrote a book which has an 1862 kind of a title, The Various Contrivances by Which Orchids Are Fertilized by Insects. Wouldn't sell very many books with that title, but there's actually a picture of a current version of that, a current reprint of that book. And he discusses pollinators in great detail. And he looked at a plant called Angraecum sesquipedale, or Darwin's orchid, or the Christmas orchid, or the Christmas star, lots of names. It blooms this time of the year. And in the conservatory, they're actually on display, and will be on display probably for a month, because we have about 20 plants, and most of them bloom every year for us. And the flowers look like that. They have a long tail. That tail has nectar in it. It's called a nectary. So you see here a couple of flowers and a picture of the plant with flowers on it, with this nectary hanging down. Okay? So Darwin looked at this flower, and somebody shipped him one of these flowers. And he looked at the flower and he thought, oh my. Good heavens, what insect can suck it? Now, what you have to realize is that down at the bottom of that long nectary is some sugar water that the insect wants for energy. Okay? So somehow the insect has to suck the sugar water out of that flower. So he said, in Madagascar, which is where this orchid comes from Madagascar, which is a very large island off Africa, there must be a moth with a proboscis, a nose or a tongue, capable of extension to a length of between 10 and 11 inches. So if you think about this plant, the insect that's going to pollinate it and wants that sugar water is going to have to be able to get down there to the bottom of it. So that's what he's saying. He's saying something's going to have to get down there to the bottom of it to be able to get to that sugar water. Well, it was 50 or 60 years later, long after Darwin died, that they discovered this insect. Okay? Xanthopan morganii predicta, because it was predicted. And if you can see the tongue extending out. And you can go on YouTube and look up Darwin's orchid, and you can actually see this moth flying around and approaching this orchid and unwinding its tongue and inserting its tongue into the nectary and getting close enough so that it bumps into the pollen. The pollen's in the center of the flower. So it has to get up there and get to the center of the flower to get the nectar. And they've actually done videos of this now, 130 years later. So it was 1903 before they actually discovered the insect, which is a moth, and it's quite a large moth, and is only in Madagascar, which is the only place these orchids grow. So let's change pace here a little bit and talk about eating orchids. How many of you have eaten an orchid? What, have you eaten an orchid? Every one of you has. Yeah, every one of you has. You just don't know it. Vanilla is an orchid. Okay? It's a little bit, you sort of don't have. If you look at the bottle or the package, you see a flower that sort of looks like this. It's a picture of the vanilla plant. So I have a couple things about vanilla. First of all, a book dedicated only to vanilla orchids. It's actually written by a academic in the United States, even though they don't grow here. And I'll pass this around, but I do also have a couple of photos in the slide talk. So that's Vanilla planifolia. That is the commercial kind of vanilla plant that's grown. And the seed pod, okay, so here's pictures of it growing. It's a vine with leaves on it that grows up, and you can train it, and it will grab onto posts, so it's like it's growing up a tree. It's from Mexico. Not grown in Mexico very much because Mexico is too expensive to grow something like orchids. So there's the seed pod. The seed pod, remember the seed pod I showed you earlier was kind of bulky and round. The seed pod from Vanilla planifolia is long and thin like a string bean. It looks very much like a string bean. But when it's dried, you get the vanilla seed pod. Most of the vanilla that you buy is artificial. Okay, you can buy the more expensive vanilla in alcohol that's actually from seed pods, extractive seed pods. And it smells a little different than the natural vanilla. There's, in the artificial vanilla, there's one chemical compound. In this vanilla, there's lots of related chemical compounds that the plant makes that smells different than the natural. And then there's a couple of marked pages here with some more pictures. The little blue notes there indicate the pages. So vanilla is pretty important. And, we use it probably every day. It's a Mexican vine that's grown now in Madagascar. It's grown in Tahiti. It's only grown in places where the labor costs are very low. Because it's not grown in Mexico, the natural pollinator, which is a kind of a bee, doesn't grow in these countries. It's grown in India too. And so you don't have the natural pollinator. So what they do is they go out and hand pollinate it. How do they hand pollinate it? Well, they don't grow it way up a tree. They only grow it up to about head height. They grow it on coffee trees. So they're getting coffee and vanilla out of the same farm. Of course, coffee's a valuable crop. And how do they hand pollinate it? Well, they send out the little kids early in the morning, because the best time to pollinate it is like just when the sun is coming up. You hand pollinate it because the flowers only stay open one day. So you get a big pod, and you get buds on this pod, and you have a flower open, and then it wilts that same day. And then the next day another one will open and wilt. And the next day another one will open and wilt. And the best time to go out there to get it pollinated is like, early in the morning. So you send the kids out to hand pollinate it by hand early in the morning, and then go to school. So that's the way orchids are. That's the way vanilla is grown in these very poor countries, and the vanilla market is terrible. I mean, it's very variable. It goes way up and way down each year depending on climate things and marketing things, and it's pretty damaging unfortunately, to some of these industries. So that's the story of vanilla, and every time you have a package of vanilla for your cooking, you can look at it closely and you see the orchid flower. Okay, let's talk a little bit about characteristics. Phalaenopsis. There we go, Phalaenopsis. Okay, what can we tell about the Phalaenopsis flower? What are the characteristics? Well, it has bilateral symmetry. It's symmetric about the center line. The right half is the same as the left half. Okay, that's a characteristic of orchid flowers. The stamen, the male part, the pistil, the female part, are united to form the column. Where is the column? The column is the little white thing in the center. The pollinia, the pollen, are underneath there. Okay? The pollen in orchids is not dusty. It's not blown in the wind. It's always a lump. Okay? And I'll show you a picture in a moment. It's a lump that's stored in there and it's kind of sticky and tiny and yellow. And the female part is underneath behind the pollen. So underneath this column is the pollen, and then behind it being towards the center of the flower is the pistil, the female part. The flower usually has a lip. So that's the lip underneath. And so then he can go on and pollinate the next flower. So the pollen is a mass rather than powdery. The pollen mass is sticky and is transferred to the insect. And the seeds are tiny and numerous, and I've already showed you about the seeds. Contain no food source. So here is a picture of pollinia, and this is a big magnification, on the eye of a bee. So you can imagine a bee flying in, and some sort of bee pollinates Phalaenopsis, flying in, landing on that lip, trying to get in there and figure out what's going on, whether it's nectar or just the color. And then as he pulls out, he pulls the little tab, and the pollinia, which is sticky, sticks to his eyeballs. Okay, and it's actually fairly common. It's not always the eyeballs, but it's fairly common methodology for the orchids. And then he goes to another plant and leaves the pollinia, these two yellow lumps, leaves that at the next flower, and that pollinates the flower. And what do we get? We get an orchid seed pod. That's a kind of an oval one. I've shown you a kind of a green bean one, like the vanilla, and I've shown you a big fat one. So the seed pods are quite different. different, characteristic of each species. So let's now talk about Phalaenopsis, which this is what you might have. Not 100%, but 95%. They're Asian tropical epiphytes. Okay, what does that mean? They grow in Asia. They're tropical, Philippines, right on the equator. They're epiphytes. They grow on the trees, not in the trees, on the trees. They're not parasites. They're epiphytes. They grow on. They cling on. So Phalaenopsis are probably everything you have here. I'd be surprised if anybody has something different. There's about 80 species. They're easy to grow and they have long-lasting flowers. And they're big, nice, flat flowers. There's tens of thousands of hybrids. Phalaenopsis have been hybridized for over 100 years. Okay, so they cross and cross and cross and cross and cross. And they take the crosses and cross it again. There's the entry permits, as I mentioned, from Taiwan to the United States for seedlings, for the small 2-inch leaf size. Room temperature is fine for growing. It's not optimal, really. I mean, they'd like it a little warmer, they'd like it very humid, but you can grow them quite well and bloom them quite well. And they require less light than most other orchids. So we have them growing actually in the conservatory. We have them growing in a fairly shady area. Okay, the hybridizers who are growing, trying to get these fancy orchids, have very specific objectives. They like big flat flowers. People like big flat flowers to face them. They like bright colors. Well, we have quite a range of colors. They like a lot of flowers on the plant. And they have a small plant size. And the smallest plant size now has become very, very popular. So you used to have plants like this. You can now get plants like that. You know, you can go down to the grocery store and get very small plants where you can put twice as many on your shelf. That's really a new development within the past 15 years. So here's some hybrid. There's a hybrid, big and flat. Here's a species. Okay? They're not so big and not so flat. And they sort of have a different shape. They don't have that kind of filled in shape. Some more species. They have lots of color. So that's where all our colored Phalaenopsis come from. There's lots of this 80 species that there are. Lots of them are colored, but these are the natural species that grow in the jungle. There's a couple more species. Really pretty. Really hard to grow without a greenhouse. Okay, what are we trying for the market? Well, the species all smell wonderful, really smell nice. But the hybrids, they lose the smell. So it's really hard to maintain the smell. Flowers tend to be at the most an inch. Now you have 5 and 5.5 inch orchids, Phalaenopsis orchids. Most popular is the white orchid, the white Phalaenopsis. But you can get, other colors. You can get these ones with blotches all over them. The range is incredible. The species tend to be star-shaped, but the hybrids, they want them full and flat and big. The plant size, most of the species are small. to get these nice big ones, you have to take the specific species that are large. Okay, so let's talk about caring for your Phalaenopsis. Now, where are Phalaenopsis found? Mainly in the jungle, wet jungle, on the equator, as epiphytes. Those are the important things to remember. You water weekly and you fertilize weekly. Weekly, weekly is the motto. You don't want to water more than that. And you don't want to fertilize more than that. Won't help. Every week, saturate the pot and let it drain completely. After it drains, fertilize weekly. That is, use half strength. So you're looking at your Miracle Grow, your Peter's Professional, whatever it is. Use half as much. Even if it's orchid fertilizer, half as much. Okay? But every week. Okay? They're slow growers, they're slow eaters, but they need food all year round. It's a pain, but that's what will work. Keep the plant with as much light as you can get it. We are a long way from the equator. Okay? I don't have to tell you that. Keep the plant in as best light you can get here. East is great, but if you don't have east, south works quite well. And we have full windows in our apartment, skyline, and we have no problems. Full light. More light the better. Once the plant blooms, once the flowers start, it's okay to move it. Okay? But you don't want to move it very much before that. Now, you want to take it to the sink to water it, which is the best way to do it. Know the orientation of the plant and always put it back in the same orientation. That's very important. If you switch it around, the flowers will come out all torn up, all pointing in different directions. So if you want this this kind of presentation of the flowers, flat and facing the same way, remember how you have it oriented. Put a stick in it, a little indicator that tells you which way the plant sits, and always put the plant back the same way. You can clip off the dead flowers. You can clip off the spikes, the flower spikes, when they turn brown. Before they turn brown, if they're staying green, leave them. Sometimes it'll reflower from that old spike. And that sort of depends on the genetics of the plant. What species fed into that hybrid? Okay? Because some of the species will rebloom on the spikes indefinitely. So what you want to do when the last flower falls off, you want to look really carefully for new buds. And if you see new buds, leave it. But if it starts to turn brown and the brown seems to be creeping along the stem, cut the stem off at the bottom and start over. Start over meaning you want it to bloom next year. So that's what I'm saying here. Green spikes can be encouraged to rebloom. Many do, many do not. Repot every 2 years. Now here's a problem. The grower of the orchids is growing it for his optimal to sell it. Okay, he wants to sell it to Trader Joe and Trader Joe's to sell it right off the bat. Well, he's growing in different conditions than you're growing. Okay? He's growing with different media than you're growing. He doesn't want to water every week. He doesn't want to send somebody out to his greenhouse to water all these plants. He's got these huge greenhouses because he's supplying hundreds of Trader Joe's plants. So he's growing in sphagnum moss. Okay? Sphagnum moss is very expensive, but doesn't have to be watered. What's his big cost? Labor. His big cost is sending somebody out there to water every day. So he doesn't want to do that. So he grows in sphagnum moss, which he can water once a month, because he's growing under conditions in which he knows he only needs to water once a month. You can't do that in your apartment. Sphagnum moss is great for him and it's terrible for us because it decays after 2 years, and then it's fairly toxic to the plant. So you want to take your plant after the second year and repot it out of the sphagnum moss into orchid mix that has a bark base. You can buy it in all the stores, in the Lowe's and Home Depot and that kind of place. And you don't want a big pot. Don't gain anything by putting it in a much bigger pot. You want to keep it in the smallest pot you can fit it into. So most people can grow the orchids for a couple of years, and then after a while they sort of degrade. And the reason they're degrading is that moss is degrading. So you get a couple or 3 years out of it, and then it goes away. Well, that's when you need to repot.
May I ask a question?
I have one more slide, and then I'll come to questions. Okay? And this slide. No ice. Now, what have I said about the Phalaenopsis? It grows in the Philippines. It's an epiphyte. It grows in the trees. Where are the Philippines? They're on the equator. How much ice do they think they see? No ice. Ice is not the right thing. First of all, it's not enough water. You want to really soak the thing, and then you want to let it drain. So no ice is my last suggestion. And then I'll be happy to answer questions as long as you want to stay and answer and ask questions. Can we get it on?
There we go.
Here we go.
Got
Yeah.
that one.
Okay.
As someone else, I'm wondering if maybe a mic on either side of the room, if someone had, I can do one. There's another. So, Anne, you had a question, right?
This is a question about repotting. When I was in one of the nurseries one time buying orchid soil, bark, there was another little container that had charcoal, and it said add a little charcoal to your orchid bark. Can you comment on that?
Okay, we use charcoal at the conservatory. Lump charcoal, and what they call agricultural charcoal, not barbecue charcoal. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary for a home plant because it's hard to find in small amounts, and you don't want a big amount. So we have 1,000 plants, and we use charcoal up, but you don't want to buy any charcoal. So charcoal is nice because it doesn't break down, and it keeps the bulkiness of the airiness, and it absorbs a lot of the toxins that come out of the rotting material. So it isn't really absolutely necessary. The mixes that they sell, other than the fact that if the mix is sat on the shelf for a long time, a lot of physical damage has happened. And so there's a lot of stuff in the bottom, a lot of dusty stuff in the bottom, which you don't want to use. You want to use the stuff at the top of the mix. You want airiness. Remember, we're talking about an epiphyte that's hanging onto a tree. It wants to hang on to that bark, but it doesn't want soil like you find at the bottom of the tree. It wants the environment at the top of the tree. So you want an airy mix of lumps, big pieces, and you don't want the stuff in the bottom of the container.
I can probably just talk. When you are repotting, there are a lot of roots. When you're repotting, there are a lot of roots. And you want to repot it, you said, in a small pot.
Right.
What do you do with all those roots?
Okay. Well, first of all, you clip off everything that's dead.
Okay.
Everything that's stringy and black. And then you soak the plant. And those roots will get, those aerial roots, you don't want to cut them off. You don't want to cut off the healthy looking ones, the ones that are shiny and thick. If the water will, cool water will soften those roots. And you try to cram as many of those roots back into the pot without breaking them as you can.
So cramming is the answer.
Cramming is the answer.
Gotcha.
Yes. Cramming without breaking, but wetting everything will make it much more flexible. Yeah. Again, think of that plant growing up in this tree, and it's reaching out. It would like to find another branch to hang on to. So it's putting out those aerial roots. Those are very important roots. It's putting out those aerial roots, looking for another place to hang on to. And those roots have the texture of the roots makes it hang on to the bark of the tree. And they can go under the edge of the bark and in the cracks of the bark. So those roots are really adapted for hanging onto a tree in the jungle. And that's what you're trying to reproduce. You want an airy mix. The bark is like the bark of the tree. Okay? You might have lumps of charcoal in there. You might have perlite, that white particles of white stuff in there that is like mineral that keeps it airy. You want it airy, and that's why you don't want old sphagnum moss.
All of a sudden, I have a slew of shoots. My sister calls them kikis, but it seems like more than half of my orchids all of a sudden are putting out shoots. Do they ever communicate with each other? And what makes them put out shoots?
I won't say they don't communicate with each other because we don't know, basically. But they're keikis. The word is keiki, not kiki. It's Hawaiian for baby, and it's a new plant that they will put out. Are you fertilizing? You're probably over fertilizing. No. Usually it's from too much fertilizer. Once they get roots that are a couple of inches long, okay, you're talking about now a new plant that's growing on the end of the, yeah.
I've had one new plant. I have lots of shoots, but yeah, I didn't.
Not root shoots, and not spikes, but on the plant, a new plant growing on the end. That's a keiki. When the roots get to be a couple of inches long, you can put it into a new pot, and you've got a clone of that original plant. And that's what they did in the old days, is they forced lots of keikis, to multiply the plants. You can cut it off and replant it. Yeah. Usually it's too much fertilizer.
Okay, I have a question that kind of follows up a little bit. on that. I had always been told that those air roots should be allowed to be outside of the pot, and you shouldn't push them back in. So am I wrong about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me more.
If you're repotting, you want to preserve those roots, and you want to give them access to food other than just in the air. The air roots are because the plant is looking for more space, more tree bark. So soak the roots after you've repotted and clipped off the dead pieces. Soak the roots and fit as many back in as you can on the repot. But don't ever cut them off when they're growing on their own. And yes, you do want to preserve them. You don't want to cut them off. You can put them back in to get more roots inside, because they will not form roots from the bottom. They only form roots at the top, where the leaves start.
Okay, can I ask
Sure.
one more? The other question is, where do the flowers begin to appear? Are they facing the light? And in other words, if I've got a plant with all the flowers facing away from me, I'm not enjoying the flowers.
Well, once you start to see flowers open, then move it out of the light and just watch them bloom.
Okay.
But if you turn it around a lot, before the flowers open, while the buds are forming, you'll get buds pointing in every different direction.
Okay.
Okay. So once you actually have open flowers, then you don't need quite so much light, and you can move it inside. Yes, you will. They will open facing out, which you don't like.
Thank you.
I have two questions about problems. One is mealybugs. Anything to do except throw the plant out, or
No.
if you've got just a little, I know you can put alcohol on them.
70% alcohol. Every day, go out and look. Mealybugs reproduce incredibly fast. Incredibly fast. Don't be afraid to use extra alcohol. Don't pour it on. Spray it. Spray it on.
Oh, just spray it?
Spray it.
Huh.
The bottoms of the leaves. Now, some people take a Q-tip and try to
Right.
get each bug, but I find they're growing faster than I can get rid of them. Particularly the bottoms of the leaves. Okay, so hold it up and spray upward, and the tops, but you want to do it every day. 70% alcohol, the kind you buy in the pharmacy, the rubbing alcohol, what they call rubbing alcohol. It works very well at killing them. It not recommended for other plants. Okay, so 70% alcohol on orchids anytime, but I won't guarantee that it won't kill something else. So don't use it in general.
Full strength.
Full strength, yep. The way it comes out of the bottle at the pharmacy, I pour it into a spray bottle and I go around spraying. I spray every day and look really carefully.
My other question is something that's new to me. Usually when an orchid starts dying, or the flowers start dying, they just kind of dry up and fall off. But lately I've had some plants where the flowers have just sort of started drooping. They just kind of fold in on themselves. They're not drying out. I've given them water and they don't revive.
The worst thing you can usually do is give them water. Okay? You don't want to overwater. No standing water. Okay, that's why I say water once a week and drain. Fertilize once a week and drain. The draining is pretty important. You don't want it standing with wet feet. So again, let's go back to the Philippine jungles. We're up in a tree. What's happening? It's raining like mad. Okay, maybe 3 or 4 inches of water coming down. Then what happens? The storm moves on and the clouds move away, and it's sunny, 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 and hot and humid, okay, and it's drying out. So they need that drying out time. And you're putting it in a pot where they're draining to where the water is draining to the bottom. You don't want standing water. And so if it looks kind of funny about the flowers dying, don't add water, okay? Check the pot that you have it in and see if there's too much water, because that's probably the problem.
If I understood your instructions, you water first with plain water.
Plain water.
And then with the fertilized water.
Fertilized water at half strength.
At half strength.
You drain as much of the water out, hold the pot up and let it tip a little bit, let the water drain out. When it stops dripping, put in your fertilized water, do the same thing before you put it back on the shelf.
And why do you water without the fertilizer first?
To wet everything. You want it really, really wet. Okay? And then the fertilizer will displace whatever water's in there. And you're using very weak fertilizer. You're using half strength. Whatever it says, half strength. But all the time. It's much more work.
I have a question about the pots you use, and it's my assumption that the plastic, clear plastic pots with the slits in them are the best, or are there other alternatives?
Okay, again, let's go back to we want them to dry out in between. So pots with slits or holes or cuts are absolute necessity. Okay, one hole in the bottom is not the greatest thing. Okay, multiple holes in the bottom, those kind of green pots that you find with 5 or 6 holes in them, that's what you want. The pots with the slits are good too. You want it to dry out in between the watering. So.
And if it's sitting in a cache pot, it needs to be elevated off the base of that, and the pot needs to be loose around it?
Yeah, you want, if it's sitting in a cache pot, you don't want water in that cache pot that's wetting the bottom. So you can do the watering and the fertilizing, and then look the next morning and you'll see water in there. Dump it out and let it dry. Be sure there's no water standing in there in the bottom, in the cache pot. You can raise the planted pot. I use corks. I take wine corks and cut them in half the long way, so I get like this half round, and then I put 3 or 4 of those. So even if some water drips into the cache pot, I have half an inch of leeway there. So that's a trick. You get to drink the wine and then you use the cork. So no wet feet.
There are corks in the service room.
Should we try and provide extra humidity where they're growing?
Yeah, in the house it doesn't really help. You can try. You can mist every morning. You can take a misting bottle and go around and mist everything. That'll help the aerial roots. The aerial roots always want water. Most people say it doesn't help because it doesn't raise the humidity very much. Now, if you have a greenhouse window, or you want to isolate them somehow from the rest of the environment, you can raise the humidity. I mean, higher humidity will definitely help. But it's very hard to maintain in a residence.
Does it matter whether you buy your orchid at Trader Joe's or go to a nursery?
No. There's 2 or 3 dealers who provide the bulk of them. Matsui, they're down in Salinas. Westerley, they're in Carpinteria, which is near Santa Barbara. Olympic Orchids, which is in Canada. They're growing under pretty chilly conditions, but they use a lot of energy for heat. I was in Whole Foods yesterday, and there was a huge display of Phalaenopsis and other orchids. First time I've seen that Trader Joe's, this one down here, with something other than Phalaenopsis. In 2 years, I haven't seen that. They were $40, but they were very nice plants, and they came from Matsui in Salinas. Yeah, but there's the nurseries are more expensive because they're bigger and better plants, but you can buy those bigger and better plants from the big box stores too.
I have another question. Where did the story about using ice cubes in orchids? You wouldn't dream of doing that with any of your other plants. Why?
Well, there's a company in Ohio, and this goes back, let's see. I knew about it in North Carolina, so it goes back more than 20 years, that sold orchids and said, just add 3 ice cubes. And it was a selling point. Just put in 3 ice cubes. Of course, they wanted you to come back next week with a new plant, but I don't know where it came. They were the first ones to do it. It's terrible. It's underwatering, actually. Underwatering with the wrong kind of water.
Any more questions? Well, thank you, Michael.
Okay.
This has been wonderful.
Okay. Thank you. Everyone is welcome at the conservatory. They're open every day but Monday from 10 to 3. There's a senior rate, and usually the first Saturday is free. So, and there's orchid plants out there all year round. We have 1,100 in our collection.
Do you sell them?
Do we sell them?
Yeah.
No, but we have the Orchid Society, the local Orchid Society has a sale in October every year, and occasionally the gift store will bring in orchids, but they don't have enough turnover. They don't have the turnover that Whole Foods has. You go into Whole Foods and there's 100 orchids there, and they'll sell out.
So you buy them with all the big flowers and stuff that...
Well, we buy them from orchid nurseries. We buy them from orchid nurseries. Of course, we maintain them all the time. So we have plants. The collection at the conservatory was started by the Kleiss family. The Kleiss family has been here for 100 years, and Mrs. Kleiss was on the committee that founded Children's Hospital, and she donated a big collection of orchids, and we think we have some of the originals. So, but it's not unusual to have them maintained for 100 years. So.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.